The beginning. Okay, so here we are. I'm going to talk about confronting climate conflict and corporate capture from VF, the perspective of Veterans for Peace and my own perspective. Well, I'm dedicating this talk to Veterans for Peace. I've been a member for many years. It's an organization that I'm closest to, and I belong to many organizations. And I'm just so grateful for all of you. All the work that you do at whatever level you work, if you're working locally, whatever you're doing, I have total confidence that what you're doing is very valuable and important. And I'm with the Climate Crisis and Militarism Project on the steering committee there, and was one of the foundational members. I'm also dedicating this talk to the victims of US wars and climate change from our emissions, from our war emissions. And it's really a considerable problem across the world. And then I wanted to dedicate it to my husband, John. And John was on the Mekong Delta in 66 and 67, and he was a machine gunner on the rivers, and it was really a horrible thing that he lived through, but he did live through it. And he promised himself if he came back that he would work with children, and we met each other working at the state hospital with kids, and he just had a wonderful gift in working with children. He was just really a blessing to everybody and kind of a stand-in father to lots of children. This picture was taken at a protest against the Iraq War in Los Angeles by a photographer named Matthew Grandjean from France, I believe. And Matthew just focuses on taking pictures of veterans. And he saw John standing there, and he asked him to take his picture and asked him to take off his sunglasses, which he always wore. And he complied. And I've always been very grateful because I felt like it revealed his eyes. And if you look at the picture, you'll see what he suffered from Vietnam is the way I feel about it. So thank you for sharing in this with me. So I have a lot of criticisms about COP, and I'm sure many people do. But I want to let you all know that for the criticisms, there was an awful lot of good that happened there. How I came to go to COP is I applied to go with Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and I was really, really blessed that they picked me. I mean, they had people from more than 50 nations around the world, and they only picked 10 of us. So I was really, really fortunate to get to go. And it was a wonderful opportunity to meet people, to network, and to kind of get a handle on what was going on there. So as many criticisms as I have, it does bring tens of thousands of people together. And it brought, this year, there were more than 80,000 people in the United Arab Emirates. When I went, it was in Egypt. But I was able to go this year as a badged virtual participant, which had a lot of benefits, really. So I want to put the context here in terms of what the climate impacts really are, what's going on with climate. And I don't know if any of you remember James Hansen, but he was a physicist, the head of NASA's global space mission, and he spoke to Congress in 1988, warning them about the impacts of climate and that global warming had actually started. And there's a whole big story on that. But when he talked to them, they took it very seriously. And it wasn't long after that that the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was formed. And what that is, the UNFCCC is a treaty. And all of the countries that sign on to that treaty are what they call Convention of the Parties. So that's COP. It's all the people that have signed on to it. And COP doesn't have a logo of its own. Every year, whoever puts it on just uses their word. And then the IPCC was also formed, and it's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And what that is, it's made up of scientists from all over the world, thousands of them. And it's intended to guide us, and we as or the diplomats as they make decisions, the parties that make decisions. So there were also negative responses, but those are the positive ones that came out of James Hansen's talk. One of the things that happened out of that is ExxonMobil decided they would start a disinformation campaign on climate, which has been very, very successful. They said that it would be a success when the average person decided that this climate science was really not clear and not sure. So I think I missed a slide here. Yeah, so what I wanted to say is that, you know, the knowledge of climate change has been around for a long time, and all of these presidential administrations have more or less kicked the ball down the road. The Biden administration has done more for climate than anyone because they put all of the governmental entities and institutions, called on all of them to make their and abide by guidelines to meet climate considerations in their actions. But I'm afraid that President Biden has lost a lot of ground with his continuing fossil fuel production and the war on Gaza, and it's really undermined whatever positive work that he's done, is what it feels like to me. And then for the first time in history, when the CEO of Halliburton, Dick Cheney, and oil man George W. Bush became the administration of the United States, that opened the door for fossil fuel interests to become predominant, supported from the nation's highest office. The George W. Bush administration, according to the House Committee on Oversight of Governmental Reform, made efforts to manipulate climate and mislead policymakers and the public about the dangers of global warming. And I'm putting that slide just ahead of this one because just as the Bush administration set a precedent for the United States, I think this is what we're seeing on the international scene with the United Arab Emirates, that in a major conflict of interest, they called for Sultan Al Jaber to be the CEO of Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, to be the president of COP. So it was a major conflict of interest and very upsetting to people all over the world. Now, part of the reason that they were able to sell Al Jaber to the public was on the basis of his green credentials, as he was had been the head of UAE's renewable energy company, Masdar, for many years. And that's how a lot of people bought into it. Now, if you've looked ahead, and I know Jim knows this, that COP, the next one this year, will be held in Azerbaijan, and they have also already chosen their leader for COP. And again, he served 26 years in the state oil company of Azerbaijan. That's SOCAR, and has been its current Ecology and Natural Resources Minister. So that's, I think they're using the same playbook, so to speak. So I wanted to call your attention to what the United States has been doing, and I'm sure many of you are already aware. But the United States was once looked on with just complete respect, or a lot of respect worldwide. And I think they've lost a lot of that edge at COP because of our hypocrisy. I mean, when Biden came into the administration, he had a major summit right away on climate, and he was trying to position himself as a leader of climate. But then we see that he went ahead with fossil fuel production after he said he wouldn't. And this is viewed as hypocrisy, and it's really undermined our relationship with the global South. The U.S. is now the world's largest oil producer, and according to official sources, the U.S. is currently producing more oil than any country in the history of the world, at 21.4 million barrels per day. And you can see that in the graph up there on the right. The United States also holds a record for the most cumulative emissions in the world. Since we industrialized early, we've put more than 509 gigatons of CO2 into the atmosphere since 1850. And even though China is by far the largest emissions producer at this point, on a per capita basis, the United States is still the larger use of fossil fuels on a per person basis. Part of these emissions are the result of wars. We have, as all of you know, the US Department of Defense has put more emissions into the atmosphere than any other institution on the planet. And the military emissions, not including war-related emissions, that's 2,750 tons of CO2 equivalent, are now estimated to be about 5.5% of the whole around the world. And yet, these emissions are not reported at the United Nations Framework Commission on Climate Change. And that's because under the Clinton administration, a deal was pulled where they would be given a special exemption. And that's been, they now are voluntarily emitted, I'm voluntarily reported, but they are not mandated to do that. And so in the war-related activities of the United States and Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, and Syria, we're estimated to have been responsible for 440 million tons of CO2 equivalent between 2001 and 2018. I'm bringing this slide up to remind you all that the COP process requires trust and cooperation. I mean, we are trying to set aside a historical record of centuries of fighting with each other. And oh my God, I have a phone. Sorry. That requires trust. And apparently the military industrial complex didn't get the message on that one. In 2014, Edward Snowden released documents that revealed that in 2007, the US was spying on diplomats at 2013, and the NSA spied on diplomats and heads of state in COP 15 in Copenhagen. And this was really met widely across the world with a lot of distrust and anger. Angela Merkel was absolutely incensed. The goal from doing this, of course, was to allow the US to go in and make negotiations already knowing what other people were going to say, and to avoid moving forward a lot on the process. So this slide is a picture of me, and the US State Department is in the lower bottom there. And while I was at COP27 in Egypt, they called a special meeting for delegates, and I raised my hand immediately. I knew exactly why I went to COP. I went to COP, I sought that out specifically to call attention to the issue of military emissions on climate. And we had tons of handouts, talked to people day and night. And so this was my opportunity to address the State Department itself, and they didn't interrupt me. I told them that I was there representing the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom that shared the same values of Veterans for Peace, who had chapters around the country and some outside of the country. And also I was representing UUs, as I'm on the board with a Unitarian Universalist for a Just Economic Community, which is a national board. And they didn't interrupt me. Their response was rather short and vague. They were aware of the problem and understood it, but they more or less put it aside. But at least I got that message out to them and also out to the other US delegates. So now I'm going to go into COP28. And I just again want to remind you of just my high esteem that I hold this convention in, even though, as I said, it's very questionable in many, many ways. So great opulence at the United Arab Emirates. They met from November 30th to December the 12th, and they representatives from 197 countries were there to discuss their challenges and make plans on climate efforts. And it was the first COP to do what they call a global stock take, which is evaluate how much they had achieved over these years in accordance with the Paris Agreement. So before Al Jaber took over, there was an official handover of the convention from the outgoing COP president, Sami Shukri, who was the COP president from Egypt. And he made a commemoration there calling for a remembrance of Salim Hook, an eminent climate scientist from Bangladesh, and also for Peter Betts, who was a longtime negotiator who had helped deliver the Paris Agreement. And then, most touchingly, he added, as well as all the civilians who have perished during the current conflict in Gaza. And people stood in unison and in silence, and it was really very touching. So you can see it's a packed audience and everybody is giving rapt attention. So Al Jaber's appointment to the COP presidency garnered a lot of media coverage and international outrage because of the conflict of interest. And when he presented himself at COP, he said a lot of the right things. But very shortly, I think the second day, he made a faux pas in which he said that the science didn't really call for cutting fossil fuels to meet COP goals of maintaining the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal. And this just caused total outrage. I mean, people were very, very upset about that. The science is the whole basis for this thing. And then towards the end of the convention, OPEC released just to its own people a document asking all of their members to not sign on to any documents that even use the word fossil fuels. So that was leaked to the media, and there was a media frenzy globally around that, and people were alert and aware of it. And I really think that that may well have been a contributing factor to the fact that OPEC nations all signed the final document. And it's the first time in 30 years that we've had a final document that mentioned the words fossil fuels. We didn't get a phase out. We got a transition away from, and we didn't get a timeline. So it wasn't a strong statement in the final document, but nonetheless, it was the global first. And it's been touted as the beginning of the end for fossil fuels because there was a consensus, all nations participating signed it. The UN Secretary Antonio Guterres was calling for taxing the windfall on fossil fuel industry profits. And that's because, as you see on the column there on the right, the profits that they were raking in 2022 were off the charts. He also called people's attention to the fact that we can't just debate fossil fuels. We can't just phase out fossil fuels. We're too far along at this point. We have to wean ourselves off of them entirely. And this is the most media coverage I've seen at COP, and I think it's probably because of how severe the climate crisis is around the world at this point. And this is the president of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, addressing the UN General Assembly. And he said that, you know, all of us should be putting our energy towards realizing our goals for the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. But instead, our energies have once again been diverted by the scourge of war. And I'm sure most of you are well aware that South Africa went to the International Court of Justice with a suit against Israel for genocide. And it was very, very well presented. I was fortunate to be able to watch it live. I was up in the middle of the night, so I got to see it. But it was very much on people's mind at COP. Various heads of state also called this out. King Abdullah from Jordan and President Erdogan from Turkey both called it out. And Erdogan called out the fact that the crimes against Gaza constitute war crimes, and that Israel should be held accountable under international law. And he also called for an independent Palestinian state based on the 1967 borders at the end of this conflict. Conflict? It's a genocide, right? Okay, so this is President Macron from France, and he and also the UK's Prime Minister were the only two members of the United Nations General Assembly Security Council that actually physically showed up at COP themselves. And Macron really did an excellent job. I mean, he talked very fast for 12 minutes, describing everything that France was doing. And it looks like they are really taking climate very seriously. And he's positioning himself as a real leader in that process. This is Modi, Prime Minister Narendra Modi from India. And he's saying that we need to base our principles working on climate for equality, climate justice, shared responsibilities, very high-minded. And as always, because he's always done this, he expresses repeated concerns for the need of climate financing. India has a massive population and they don't have money. So this is an issue for many, many countries around the world, and was the most addressed topic at COP was the need for funding. This is Lula da Silva, the president of Brazil, who recently took over from the right-wing Bolsonaro, and Bolsonaro had been noted for his destruction of the forest there. And Silva has really been trying to turn that around. Unfortunately, he got kind of slammed right away because his energy minister, Silveira, announced as he was coming to COP that Brazil was going to align itself with OPEC. What a shock. So that really undermined him. And I don't know, it appears that there's still a huge division in Brazil. I don't know how it's going to turn out. Kamala Harris showed up instead of Biden and said this is a pivotal point for our collective action. But I'm sure she was embarrassed. I mean, most of us were really embarrassed for the United States because we only pledged $17.5 million, not billion, dollars to the loss and damage fund, which is just a major fund and a really big deal. And nations that didn't have anywhere near our resources were giving more. So she did say that she would, she did announce that the U.S. would pledge a much higher amount for the Green Climate Fund, but that hasn't really been authorized by Congress. So I'm sure she took a lot of flack while she was at COP for U.S. stances and failure to come through with the money that's needed. Of course, we understand it's a Republican Congress and in some respects. So anyway. So while all of these things were going on and the heads of state were speaking, there's all these meetings, constant meetings, nations looking at all kinds of aspects of climate, making decisions. It's a huge, very, very busy scene. People are always rushing around. And we also, especially those of us there who are activists who are trying to encourage each other to keep going on, because we went there with a purpose. And when you see what's going on, it's very disheartening sometimes. So we have to comfort one another. Okay, so I'm bringing this slide up because just ahead of COP, James Hansen, at this late date, another 50 years past his earliest release, has come up with a new paper. And this paper is a big deal. It's a really big deal. I've had it looked at by professional sources, and my understanding is that it's possible that Hansen is wrong, but it was a very compelling paper. What Hansen is saying is that the IPCC in their climate models really made a mistake in not really looking at the particles that are going into the atmosphere, these small particles, and that the shipping industry changed their fuel from a highly sulfur-based fuel to a less sulfur-based fuel. And when they did that, they quit emitting all of these particles into the atmosphere, and that is probably the reason why we're seeing rapid intensifying climate changes. We just didn't take into consideration all of these aerosols. So he's warning us it's going to get a lot worse, a lot faster. He also called for specifics on how to counter this. And he said we have to transition from conflict to cooperation. We've got to move to third parties that refuse special interest funding. He feels like both parties have been bought off, and I think that's quite understandable. He's saying we've got to quit funding fossil fuel subsidies, and that we need to go to ranked voting. And probably the ranked voting, I mean, I see that that's been something that's been worked on locally, and it's a means to get in other parties. Anyway, I don't know if you see it. So Hansen also said that what's going on is there's this imbalance between the energy, that the sun's radiation is not being able to escape, because when the aerosols reduced out of the shipping fuel, it reduced the cloud cover, and the cloud cover has been protecting us from how hot we would be otherwise. So we have a lot of allies at Climate Crisis and Militarism Project. And fortunately, one of them is Tom Goldtooth, who's the director of the Indigenous Environmental Network. When we first formed, we were collecting signatories to a letter to John Kerry, and the IEA signed on to that. And he's a standby at COP. He's been to every COP going back to, I guess he missed the first 4. Anyway, he felt it was a tremendous failure. He said we watched firsthand as fossil fuel polluters and wealthy nations manipulated developing countries to undermine real action on climate change, and that the indigenous leaders, the youth, the various groups within the Indigenous Environmental Network spoke with one group demanding a rapid transition for a phase out of fossil fuels. One of the problems that has been surfacing at COP for quite a long time is something we refer to as false solutions, and that includes carbon capture and storage. And so I was excited to have found this particular report that says 90% of the US commercial carbon capture and storage in 2021 was actually used, injected back into oil rigs to get out the last dregs of the hard to get oil. And so then it comes back up again and is again polluting the atmosphere. So it is something of a sham. And Tom Goldtooth also spoke to this. He said, our strong message on fossil fuels phase out has fallen on deaf ears. More solutions, false solutions will accelerate climate change. So he is a strong supporter of getting off fossil fuels. If we get off fossil fuels, we don't have to try to do these other things that the technology doesn't really exist yet to do. So this is another side event. It was put on by the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom at COP28. And you'll see on the right, far right, there's Michelle Benzing, a young up-and-coming leader at WILF, and then Anita Crawford, who spoke at the VFP convention. I think it was last year. She's just amazing. And Deborah Burton, who is also incredibly amazing. And the other 4 women I haven't met, I don't know, but they put on a tremendous event at COP, acting on military spending and military emissions, climate and gender justice. And I stole this quote from a document that these groups collectively submitted to the UNFCCC, calling on them to meet their responsibilities at addressing military emissions. Another one of the side events at COP, War, Carbon, and Infrastructure, Whole Supply Lines and Military Emissions Gap, is very exciting to me. In the upper right, you see a slide there of Dr. Oliver Belcher. I was using his data when I first started giving my talks on climate in 2018. He's got wonderful data and years of research there. And these other folks have done fantastic work as well. We're in regular communication with Ellie Kinney. She was at COP last year, and I took that picture of her. Anyway, she's doing wonderful, wonderful work, and young, enthusiastic, bright, a big future ahead. And we're really continuing to bring this issue up at every opportunity with formal letters, formal meetings, everything we can. This is Lindsay Cottrell and Leonard de Klerk. And Leonard de Klerk really opened the door at COP for us to begin to address military emissions. When Ukraine was being bombed by Russia, he wanted to do something to help the Ukrainian people. And he's a real techie geek. He's a real scientist. He understands a lot of things. And he got in there, and they actually had a on-the-ground international research team in Ukraine as they were being bombed. And he put together a great report on that. And the Ukraine brought that forward at COP27. The Ukrainian pavilion was probably one of the busiest at COP27. And the good thing about it is, folks, you all know, the US wars have brought tons of emissions in with our wars in Iraq and our wars in Afghanistan. Hey, further back in that, our wars in Vietnam. But those wars were never going to make it inside of COP. It took a war that Russia was doing in order to get that going. But it has now opened the door for us to take this seriously to internationally. And Leonard de Klerk is now working on Gaza emissions, and you can find that online too. Lizzie Cottrell is just amazing. She does all kinds of research and talks, and she's with the Conflict and Environment Observatory, and that's a group that we work really closely with at the Climate Crisis and Militarism Project. So, okay, I just love this woman, Mia Mottley. She's amazing. She was the Prime Minister of Barbados, and at COP, so many nations had just really suffered tremendously as a result of COVID that they weren't even able to show up. But her country was so impacted by COVID. They were impacted by rising food prices because of what was going on with the war in Ukraine. And then they had these serious climate impacts, and they were already shouldering so much debt. They were just really in a very, very bad way. So she and her team put together something called the Bridgetown Initiative, calling for some serious reforms. And Al Gore supported her at COP27 and called for the head of the World Bank to step down because of his role in predatory lending practices against Africa. And he did step down. He was out by January of last year. So what we're looking at in terms of economic losses associated with climate change is really very serious. We're now needing 2.4 trillion annually now in order to meet these challenges, and that money just is not coming to the table. Nobody is coughing it up. So on this slide, what you see on the right is upper hand corner is AJ Banga, who is the new president of the World Bank, taking over after the last one was left in disgrace. And the question is the World Bank going to be able to do this? So both the World Bank and the IMF are centered in DC. They have wide-ranging responsibilities. And I believe I read something, but I couldn't find the source to document it here. And that is that the United States has cut the World Bank's funding. The World Bank is trying to make reforms. They're offering a pause on interest and principal payments for nations that are in trouble with climate. They're making fees that are covered by to be covered by concessional resources. They're broadening the scope of their climate resilience debt clauses to cover existing loans from vulnerable countries. One of the things that they're doing that I didn't find very helpful was pushing carbon markets. The research on carbon markets is absolutely a nightmare. It's dreadful, a scam. But being aware of that, Benga is saying that he is going to do investigations in the work to make sure that future carbon markets will have the integrity to be acceptable. So this is Kristalina Georgieva, and she's heading up the IMF. And I found her to be incredibly personable. I mean, I watched a number of side events that were related to climate. I mean, excuse me, related to economy, and that is not something that I've paid attention to in my life. So they seem to really be bringing a lot of sensitive concern to the issue. They weren't bringing the money though, and the money is where it's at. But we'll see how it plays out. I do think that they are really making efforts. But here again, she's saying that we need $2.4 trillion a year to meet the climate needs, and that where are we going to get it? So, you know, being from Veterans for Peace, I bet you guys have a good idea where we could get it. How about the military budget? You know, I mean, really, there's where the money is going for this country. Our own budget in this country is the greater portion of that 2.4 trillion. The 2.4 trillion, I'm sure, is easily met this year if the other countries put in what they did before, because the US has raised theirs considerably this round. So there's the money. I mean, it's really in our face. Are we going to be a people who take climate crisis serious and fund it, or are we going to continue our tactics of warfare? And I don't know what's going to happen, but this is what we're up against. So guys, that was a long talk. I still have a little more, but this is the night before negotiations. Not before negotiations, before the announcement of the final document. So these are delegates that are staying up at night, trying to understand it, trying to see what's going on, and being prepared for the morning and getting their revisions in early. So this is early in the morning then when they all met again. Whatever revisions were on the table had been included, and Al-Jaber took his gavel and slammed it down, and the final document was accepted for the record. Now, a lot was done that was beneficial at COP, but there was one problem with him doing that. And that was that there were 39 island nations that weren't even in the room when he did that. They came in late because they were so upset and trying to figure out what to do about the document. So this woman is representing 39 nations. She's from Samoa. And she's calling out the fact that the final document made no mention of the peak emissions needing to be the year for the peak emissions being 2025. Now, this was a big deal. It's because in last year's document, they were saying we had to meet this by 2025, or it was likely we were going to have so many tipping points that we wouldn't be able to counter them. But it wasn't even mentioned this year. And then in another thing that I watched, it was explained to me by a woman from India, I believe, that a doctor, she gave a wonderful presentation. She said that they can't afford to bring that up at COP28, because the poor nations, even if they met all of their NDAs, there's no way they could bring the peak emissions down. The only countries that can do that are all of us high emitters. And so since we didn't do it and haven't done it, it wasn't being mentioned. And then referencing the false solution, she said, you know, we're being asked to endorse these technologies that were written in the document, and we feel that they could undermine our efforts and potentially push us backwards. They found the document full of loopholes. They were not happy that it didn't have a subsidy phase out and didn't advance us past the status quo. Their talk was very, very rigorous. I'm only giving you a small glimpses of it. You know, the island nations, some of them are just a few feet above sea level. We cannot afford to return to our islands with the message that this process has failed us. We cannot deliver. If we can't deliver this phase out, it doesn't advance us beyond the status quo. We've come to the conclusion that the course correction that is needed has not yet been secured. We've made incremental advancements over business as usual, when what we really need is exponential action and support. So she was surrounded by other members. You can see the woman behind her in that picture on the left, and she's got a really serious look on her face. These people were devastated. And then she closes, Mr. President, we must leave here with a set of decisions that fail to meet essentially what is needed, fail to meet the expectations of what the world has sent us to do, and have failed to meet what is needed to secure the future of coming generations. Very emotional. Slowly, the audience began to get to their feet. Shortly, everyone in the room was on their feet, giving her a standing ovation that lasted at least 2 minutes. What she said resonated with them. They understood that the document that they had passed was not going to cut it for those that are the most vulnerable. So I'm going to move now to statements from Bolivia that I just really found very powerful. So he is basically calling out what was going on COP as colonialism, climate colonialism, and that the rollback was being done to past work. We weren't meeting the Paris Accords, and this was because the developed countries were trying to avoid paying the money that's needed to the poorer countries. Pakistan spoke, many nations spoke, China spoke. China wasn't happy with what was being done. China also has a lot going on. I don't know if you're all aware of BRICS expansion, but that's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa have come together some 15 years ago. And they've just been joined by many other nations, including Iran, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, other nations, and they are setting up their own banks. and they don't intend to use the US dollar. And they are really tired and sick and tired of the what the IMF's long years of taking advantage of people in the extreme, and they are moving forward to do their own thing. Antonio Guterres just came out with a document the last couple of days saying, oh my God, essentially, this could be really disruptive. We're on our way to a multipolar world and not the unipolar world that the US is used to, and it's going to be a difficult time, but we've got to try to collaborate with one another. So anyway, was COP a success or a failure? For many, it was too little, too late. There were a lot of things that were done. One of the failures was they didn't take reform seriously about including military emissions. They did pass call for transitioning off fossil fuels, renewing energy, tripling that, and doubling energy efficiency. So Hansen is suggesting that we need to end wars, and that's something we all support. And we have to stop subsidizing the climate crisis with those fossil fuel subsidies that are $7 trillion. We need to divest from fossil fuels. And this fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty is something it would be good if we could sign on to. 12 countries are now pushing it. It's got hundreds of organizations that are signing and thousands of individuals that have signed it. So if anyone wants to join us at CMP, or if you're not a member of VFP, please do so. And we're doing a lot of work. We're working with labor, veterans and labor for sensible priorities. We're working with youth groups. We're working now with 350.org nationally. We're holding no military air shows, and the big push always is if anyone would like to see the climate and militarism slideshow, we show those for free. So keep on trucking, guys. It's good. Thank you for having me, and I'm sorry for going so far over time.
Thank you, Cindy. And for everybody out there, this is why when Cindy came on our radio show, we ended up doing 2 shows, because she is just so thorough, so knowledgeable, and so engaging. Once she gets started, then you just can't turn away.